Not when my granddaughter called me crying from a gas station at 11 o'clock at night. Not then. That was the moment I knew exactly what my daughter had done. But let me start at the beginning because the beginning matters. The beginning is always where the quiet falls apart. My name is not important. What is important is that I am 73 years old. I live in a yellow house on Clover Street in Dayton, Ohio, and for the better part of 46 years, I worked as a bookkeeper for a heating and cooling company called Hartwell and Sons. I knew numbers the way some women know recipes, by heart, without measuring, without second guessing. I could spot an error in a ledger the same way I could spot a crooked picture frame on a wall. Something just looked wrong, and I would know. My husband Gene passed in the spring of 2019. Pancreatic cancer. We had 41 years together, and I will not pretend the grief was anything other than what it was: enormous and quiet and present in every room of the house at once. He used to make the coffee in the morning. That was his thing. I never asked him to do it. He just did. For 3 years after he died, I made the coffee myself every single morning, and every single morning the kitchen felt slightly wrong in a way I couldn't explain to anyone. My daughter, I'll call her my daughter, lives about 40 minutes away in Centerville. She's 51 now, married a man I never fully trusted, not because he was cruel, not because he drank, but because he had the particular quality of a person who is always calculating something just behind his eyes. You know the type. You've met them. They agree with everything you say while they're looking at your furniture. We were not a wealthy family, let me be honest about that. Jean and I did not have extravagant things. What we had was a house that was paid off, a modest savings account, a retirement account I had built carefully over decades of working, and a small rental property, a duplex 3 blocks over that Jean had bought in 1994 for practically nothing, and that I had managed ever since he passed. The tenants were good people. They paid on time. That duplex was, in many ways, my safety net, and I knew it. For the first 2 years after Jean died, my daughter was attentive in the way people are when grief is fresh and visible. She called on Sundays. She came for Christmas. She took me to my cardiologist appointments and waited in the plastic chairs without complaint. I was grateful. I said so. I told her often that she was a good daughter, and I meant it because I believed it, because I did not yet have reason to believe anything else. It started with a question, the way these things do. She said, sitting at my kitchen table with a cup of coffee in her hands, "Mom, have you thought about what happens to everything if something happens to you?" I told her I had a will. I told her the attorney had drawn it up after Jean passed, and that everything was in order. She nodded. But the nod had a small hesitation in it, a slight wobble, as though she was accepting an answer she already knew was incomplete. The next visit, she brought her husband. He sat at my table and opened his laptop and used words like estate planning and probate costs and the burden on family and long-term care scenarios. He had clearly looked things up. He had a whole presentation, really, though it wasn't called that. It was called conversation, really, though it wasn't called that. It was called conversation. It was called concern. He showed me numbers about nursing home costs in Ohio, and those numbers, I will admit, were real. They are real. $4,500 a month for a memory care facility in Dayton is not a fiction. "We're not suggesting you need that now," my daughter said quickly. "We just want to make sure we're set up to help you, Mom, if it ever comes to that." What they were suggesting when they finally said it plainly was that I put my daughter's name on my accounts, not as beneficiary, as joint owner. I want to be clear about the difference because it matters enormously, and I think many people do not know it. A beneficiary receives your assets when you die, after the account goes through whatever process it goes through. A joint owner can access those assets right now, today, this afternoon, while you are still alive and sitting in your yellow house on Clover Street drinking your morning coffee alone. I told them I would think about it. I thought about it for 3 days, and then I called my attorney, a woman I'd used since 1998, sharp and plain-spoken in the way I have always preferred. She listened. She said the same thing I already knew. Adding a joint owner is not the same as naming a beneficiary. She said to be careful. She said to trust my instincts. My instincts said wait. But I am also a mother. And being a mother, I have learned, can make a person override their own instincts in the name of keeping the peace, keeping the relationship, keeping the softness in someone's voice when they call you on Sunday. I did not add my daughter to my accounts. What I did instead 6 months later was something smaller, something that felt reasonable at the time. I gave her the login information to my online banking, just so she could check on things, I told myself. Just so someone knew what was happening with my finances if something happened to me. I kept all the cards. I kept all the checkbooks. I changed nothing legally. I simply handed her a window into my numbers, and I told myself that was the cautious version of what they had asked for. I was wrong to do even that. I didn't know it yet, but I was wrong. The next 18 months were ordinary, quiet. I tended my garden, which Jean had started and I had continued, and I managed the duplex, and I drove myself to my appointments, and I had lunch with my friend on Thursdays, a woman I've known since we were both young mothers pushing strollers around the same park. Life was manageable. Life was mine. My granddaughter, my daughter's youngest, was 19 and had just started at Sinclair Community College. She called me sometimes on Tuesday afternoons for no particular reason, and I loved those calls more than I could say. She had Jean's eyes and my stubbornness and a quality of paying attention to things that I found remarkable in someone so young. She noticed things. She remembered things you said 3 months ago. She was the one who told me, not directly, not at first. What she said on a Tuesday afternoon in October was, "Grammy, do you know your daughter was talking to a real estate agent?" I said, "What do you mean?" She said she had overheard a phone conversation. Her parents didn't know she was home. Her mother was on the phone with someone, and she heard her say the duplex on Maple, and the owner is elderly, and we have access to the account, and we're looking at a timeline of spring. I sat down. I want to tell you I reacted immediately, that I picked up the phone and called my attorney that afternoon and started making calls. But that is not what happened. What happened is I sat down in my kitchen and I looked at my hands for a long time. I thought about the Sunday phone calls. I thought about the Christmas dinners. I thought about the cardiologist waiting room and the plastic chairs and the way my daughter used to hold my hand in the car. I thought maybe I misunderstood. Maybe my granddaughter misunderstood. I gave it a week. Then, very quietly, I logged into my online banking and I looked at every transaction for the past 6 months. I want to be a bookkeeper again for a moment and tell you what I saw. I saw 12 transfers. 12. Over 6 months. Totaling, I had to write it down to believe it, just over $14,000. They were never large enough individually to trigger any kind of alert. 300 here, 700 there, 1,200 once in July, which I had to think about for a moment before I remembered that July was when her husband said the air conditioning unit in their house needed replacing. $14,060 from my savings account, which she had never been given permission to touch. She had been given a window. She had used it as a door. I closed the laptop. I did not call her. I called my attorney. Here is what my attorney and I did in the following 3 weeks, and I want to tell you this part carefully, because this is the part that matters. First, we documented everything, every transfer, dated and printed. My attorney contacted the bank and had the full transaction history pulled and certified. We also contacted the county recorder's office to confirm that no paperwork had been filed regarding the duplex. Nothing had yet, though I later learned there had been an inquiry made to a title company in September. Second, I changed everything. All of it. Online banking passwords, PIN numbers, and I removed any record of my accounts from any device my daughter might have accessed. I contacted the bank directly, in person, and had a note placed on my accounts flagging them for unusual activity monitoring. Third, and this was my attorney's idea, and it was a good one, I had a new will drawn up. The original will had split my estate between my daughter and a charitable remainder trust Jean and I had discussed years ago. The new will did not split anything. The duplex, the savings, the retirement account, and the house on Clover Street. All of it went directly to my granddaughter, with a portion designated to the local humane society because Jean had loved dogs his whole life and we never had the right kind of yard for one. My daughter's name was removed entirely. I did not tell her. I did not tell her for 3 more weeks. In those 3 weeks, she called me twice. Both times, normal. Both times, how are you feeling? How was the garden? Did you see the Browns game? Both times I said I was fine. I said the garden was put to bed for winter. I said I hadn't watched football since Jean passed. All of this was true. I was fine. I was more than fine. I was, for the first time in a long time, completely clear-headed about what was happening in my own life. The conversation came on a Saturday. I asked her to come over. I did not tell her why. She came with her husband, which I had half expected, and they sat at my kitchen table the same way they had sat there years ago, with the laptop and the estate planning language and the concerned faces. I made coffee, real coffee, the good kind Jean used to buy from the little shop on Brown Street that shipped it from a farm in Colombia. I made it the way he showed me. I set out cups. I sat down across from them. I said, I've been going through my finances. My daughter smiled, said, "Oh, good, Mom, that's a good idea." I said, "I found the transfers." The smile didn't disappear immediately. It took a moment, like a light that flickers before it goes out. Her husband looked at his hands. I put the printed pages on the table. All 12 transactions, dated, amounts, all of it. I said, $14,000. My daughter said, "Mom, I can't explain." I said, "I've already spoken with an attorney." That is when her husband stood up, not to leave, not to threaten. He stood up the way people stand up when the ground has shifted and they need a moment to recalibrate. He said something about how this was a misunderstanding, how they had meant to tell me, how the money was only borrowed, how they were going to pay it back. I let him speak. I did not interrupt. I have learned in 73 years that there is more information in letting someone speak than in stopping them. When he was finished, I said, "I want you to know that I am not calling the police today." I had discussed this with my attorney. Elder financial abuse is a criminal offense in Ohio. I had that option. I chose not to use it, not because I forgave them, but because my granddaughter loved her mother, and I was not going to be the person who put her mother in handcuffs if I didn't have to. I said, "What I am doing is this. The money will be repaid in full within 60 days. My attorney has drawn up a repayment agreement. You will sign it today before you leave my house." My daughter started to cry. I watched her cry. I want to be honest about what that felt like, because I think people expect it to feel like victory. It did not feel like victory. It felt like grief of a different kind, a grief that had no casseroles brought to the door, no flowers, no cards, a grief for something you thought you had and then learned, late, that you never quite had in the form you thought. But I did not move from my chair. I did not hand her a tissue. I poured myself more coffee and I waited. Her husband signed the repayment agreement. My daughter signed it. My attorney had written it cleanly, the full amount, a schedule of monthly payments of $500, a clause specifying that failure to pay would result in legal action, a clause acknowledging the nature of the transfers as unauthorized access to my accounts. They left without finishing their coffee. I sat in the kitchen for a while after. I looked out the window at the garden, which was bare and brown and waiting for spring, the way gardens do. I thought about the duplex on Maple, and how Jean had bought it for almost nothing in 1994, and how he had been so proud of it, and how it was still mine. I thought about my granddaughter calling me on a Tuesday afternoon in October. I thought about Jean's eyes in her face. I thought about how she had called me not to accuse anyone, not to start anything, but simply because she thought I should know. 2 weeks later, I drove over to Sinclair and took my granddaughter to lunch at the diner on Salem Avenue, where they make the kind of turkey sandwich that has become almost impossible to find. Real roasted turkey, not the pressed kind on actual bread with actual cranberry sauce. We sat for 2 hours. I told her what I had done. Not all of it, but enough. I told her about the new will. I told her she did not need to worry about me. She didn't say much for a moment. Then she said, "Grammy, I was scared to tell you. I didn't want to hurt you." I told her that was exactly the right instinct and exactly the wrong call. I told her the kindest thing she could ever do for me was tell me the truth, even when it was hard, even when it hurt. That was love. Everything else was just performance. She nodded. She has Jean's way of nodding, slow and full, like she means it. The repayment started 61 days later, 1 day late, which I noted and did not comment on. $500 a month. My attorney monitors the schedule. We're on month 4. My daughter and I have not spoken since that Saturday morning, not beyond a brief text at Christmas that said, "Merry Christmas, Mom," and to which I replied, "Merry Christmas," because I am not cruel and I am not at war. I am simply no longer available to be used. The garden came back in April, the way it always does. I planted the same things Jean and I always planted. Tomatoes along the south fence, zucchini because it grows whether you pay attention to it or not, marigolds along the border because Jean said they kept the pests away, and I have never once tested whether that's true. I just plant them because he planted them. The duplex is still mine. Both units occupied, rent paid on time, gutters cleaned out last fall by a handyman my granddaughter found for me on some app on her phone and called beforehand to make sure he was reputable. I still make the coffee in the morning. The kitchen still feels slightly wrong, the same as it always has since Jean left. But the rest of the house feels right, fully, finally, quietly right. I've been sitting with this story for a while now, turning it over the way you turn a stone in your hand. Not looking for anything in particular, just feeling the weight of it. What my daughter did was wrong. I'm not going to soften that or find a more charitable word for it. $14,000, taken in small pieces over 6 months, from a woman who had spent 46 years earning every cent of it carefully and honestly. That is a choice, a series of choices. And choices like that don't come from nowhere. They come from somewhere a person built inside themselves, slowly, over a long time. I think about Gene a lot when I think about this. He was not a complicated man, but he was a good one, and the thing I loved most about him was that he never confused those two things. Being good is not complicated. You know when you're taking something that isn't yours. You know when you're lying. You know when the person sitting across the table trusts you, and you're using that trust like a tool. My daughter knew. Her husband knew. They made the calculation anyway. That's the part I can't fully explain to people. Not the betrayal itself, but the clarity of it. There was no confusion in what they did. There was a window they had been given, and they decided to use it as a door, and they thought I was too old, too tired, too emotionally dependent on the relationship to look closely at my own numbers. They mistook my love for blindness. My granddaughter did not make that mistake. She was 19 years old, sitting in her parents' house, and she heard something that frightened her, and she picked up the phone and called me anyway. That took something. A kind of backbone that a lot of adults twice her age don't have. She understood, without anyone teaching her directly, that protecting someone you love sometimes means saying the hard thing out loud, even when it costs you something. That is not a small quality. That is, I think, the most important quality a person can have. As for me, I am not a hero of this story. I made mistakes. I gave access I should not have given. I let the desire to keep the peace override the part of me that already knew something was wrong. I have worked with numbers my entire adult life. I knew what joint ownership meant. I knew the difference between a beneficiary and a co-owner. I chose to do the smaller, softer version of what they asked, because I wanted to believe I was not the kind of mother whose child would do this. The lesson I carry from this is not about money. It's about clarity, the willingness to look at your own life without flinching, to read your own account statements, to listen to the part of yourself that already knows. That is not paranoia. That is not paranoia. That is self-respect. And self-respect, I have come to understand, Lay, is something you have to actively maintain. It does not maintain itself. It requires that you stay awake to your own circumstances, even when staying awake is uncomfortable. The duplex is still mine. The garden came back in April. My granddaughter calls on Tuesday afternoons. I make the coffee the way Jean showed me. Some things, when you protect them, stay.